Welcome back to TapHere, the podcast that looks at the intersection between money and technology. And today we have not only a guest, but a company that frankly almost represents that intersection. Steve Clarke, he is head of Canada for Klarna. Klarna, known as the buy now, pay later, but certainly much, much larger and more comprehensive than that. And that's exactly where we're going to get down to today and talk about. We are thrilled to have you with us today. Steven Clarke, you are head of Canada for Klarna.
Yeah, that's right.
Everybody knows Klarna, which is really fantastic. And we hope to hear a little bit more about that. For starters, and I'm going to try to fill in some blanks on your background. Now, you've been with Klarna for about 4.5 years.
Yep, that's right.
Before that, you were with Moneris for, you said 9 years?
Yeah, 8 years about.
Okay. And you've been in the payments industry basically as long as you can remember.
Yeah, almost 20 years. So
wow.
Long time. A lot of knowledge. I don't think I'm going to be able to leave the payments industry at this point.
You never know. You never know. But it's really great to have you. I think there's a lot of questions that certainly I have. I know our viewers have about, buy now, pay later, Klarna in general. But I thought as a start, what we could really get into is the buy now, pay later. It's, itself, the definition of it. There's constantly and still confusion. So what is it and what isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. There's a lot of misconceptions, especially in Canada, where I'd say buy now, pay later is not as mature as it might be in Europe or even the US, where Klarna launched maybe about 5 or 6 years ago versus launching in Canada in 2023. But at the end of the day, what it is short-term interest-free fixed installments. And so that sounds, again, maybe a little bit convoluted. So buy now, pay later, or pay in 4 installments, as it might be also known, is the ability to spread out your payment of a transaction, but still get the goods up front. So from a consumer perspective, maybe I go to an online store, I buy a pair of shoes for $100. I'm only going to pay 25% of that up front. And then every 2 weeks thereafter, for a 6-week period, I'm going to pay another 25% increment on that original $100. So over 6 weeks, I'm paying up the $100. And it's all interest-free. So in other words, the consumer isn't paying in order to have a little bit more credit flexibility.
Now, the perception, or maybe the misperception, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, which I'm really excited about. The perception is that is not necessarily a good thing. So there are people out there that say, you can buy it now, you can pay it later. You're only paying a little bit of the money up front. Maybe you can't afford it. Now, There's a lot of stuff behind Klarna.
Yeah.
That obviously negates that, and there's some checks and balances, and we're going to hopefully cover all that. But for starters, where do you find is the best place to start in terms of really articulating what Klarna's mission is?
Yeah, I think it's really a mission from general is to make it easier for consumers to have more payment flexibility, allow them to save time, save money, be in control of their spending through a numerous number of ways, whether it's having different payment options at checkout beyond just paying for something up front, or some of the other things that Klarna brings to the table within our app that make it easier for consumers to understand their budget, understand where they're spending, and then engaging with different retailers in a different way.
And that's been something that's been, and Klarna, by the way, has been around for at least a decade longer.
Yeah, almost 2 decades, started in Stockholm, Sweden.
Exactly,
but been in Canada since 2023.
Right. Mr. Sebastian, whose name I won't try to pronounce right now. Nice gentleman. But I think going from, literally over 2 decades, the idea of really educating and embracing technology and getting people to understand how it fits into the fintech payments ecosystem.
Yeah.
Where could we start with that? Where do you think has been some of the, I guess sort of the biggest shifts or challenges in terms of what Klarna is today versus what it might have been?
Yeah, I think, it's always been a way to, find a better way for consumers to pay more responsibly. And I think going back to the point earlier you said is what is the misconception around it? And I think a lot of people do think it's going to put consumers into more debt. It's more similar to a credit card, a small loan, or a payday loan, when in actuality, most of our lending that we're doing is at zero interest to the consumer. And when you compare it to a credit card that you might be giving a consumer $10,000, allowing them to go spend that all at once, and then with no ability for them to repay it, Klarna is underwriting consumers on a transactional basis. And so what that means is each time a consumer goes to pay with Klarna at checkout, Klarna is making a decision based on a number of factors of whether we believe that consumer can pay back. And if they can't, they'll be declined. And so ultimately, that's making sure that consumers don't go further into debt. And their funding source within the Klarna wallet can be a debit card, it can be a credit card. And in actuality, the majority of our transactions are funded by a debit card, which is more responsible when you think about it, layering on the fact that Klarna has no interest for the majority of the lending we're doing.
So that's a little bit of the secret sauce right there, that maybe perhaps people who haven't really used Klarna before, and I'm even thinking about both, consumers and merchants, right? Because I mean, you're seeing more and more merchants offering it. I know that's a big part of what your role is in terms of the Canadian landscape. But what you're seeing is this hesitancy and this sort of entrenched belief that no, this is really just allowing me, to pay in easy installments, and that it's going to cause me problems if I can't make those payments, or at least the consumer.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit about sort of the, you just mentioned it, but like a little bit more detail, if you can, about sort of how and what some of those checks and balances are that prevent that from happening.
Yeah, so some of it is external data. So we will be able to do a soft credit pull, meaning the consumer's credit score isn't being affected. So we're pulling data based on their date of birth, based on the credit card or debit card they're putting into their Klarna wallet. We're able to get some information about them. And then it's also the spending behavior that they've put into place with Klarna itself. So have they paid Klarna back in the past? Have they done it on time? And that allows us to make those decisions that ultimately are in favor of the consumer to not put them further into debt. And so that could be based on, the amount they're purchasing. It could be based on where they're purchasing, what they're purchasing. And we have all that data within the construct of like how they're interacting with Klarna, either in our app or their purchase behavior.
And how quick is that data kind of pumping out at you and others?
It's instantaneous.
Yeah,
so
incredible.
like when you're making a transaction online, you wouldn't notice any kind of difference between a normal payment method.
And in terms of the merchants and the utilization of Klarna, like right now, and I'm, forgive me if this is a silly question, the only way to use Klarna is if a merchant offers it. There's no...
In Canada, that is relatively true, but in other markets where Klarna is more mature and we have a lot higher demand, we have launched other capabilities. And so there's a product in the US and some of our European markets called Shop Anywhere, where essentially you're checking out and we're producing a one-time Visa card at the time of the transaction at a merchant that isn't integrated with Klarna, as long as they're shopping within the app. And then it's putting it down a Klarna payment method. We've also launched a Klarna card in various markets. Not in Canada today, but certainly something that will be coming. And that just gives them the ability to kind of check into the app, choose how they want to pay with Klarna using a card itself, which maybe is lending to an older generation that likes using cards, or a younger generation that likes the flexibility of different ways and mechanisms in which they can use Klarna.
I mean, I'm laughing at myself because I am the older generation. I definitely, love my credit cards. But part of it is also, the discipline that comes with knowing that balance does, for all intents and purposes, really should be paid at the end of the month before the due date. So you're not getting charged that 20-odd% interest or 30-odd% interest, and that you're not getting your spending out of control. Now, maybe talk to us a little bit about sort of what are some of the things that Klarna helps assist in terms of making sure that same approach is working for people who are utilizing Klarna.
There's a couple things actually that's really interesting, especially when you compare it to a credit card. So today, if you go into the Klarna app, you're going to have a much richer experience being able to tell where you purchased and what you purchased. So as a prime example, I look at my credit card statement. I can tell I spent $500 at this retailer, but maybe I have no idea what I purchased, which could lead to chargebacks. It could lead to disputes because consumers are questioning whether they actually did spend that money. There's obviously a lot of fraud in the industry. And then if you go into the Klarna app, you're going to see I bought these 3 t-shirts, this size, this color. And so it's a lot richer of an experience.
That detailed, huh?
Yeah, we're getting SKU level data. And so a lot of younger consumers find that much more engaging. It also provides an opportunity for the retailer to engage with the consumer and us to send that customer back to the retailer within our shopping ecosystem. So when you think about Klarna as just a payment method, it's actually quite a lot more. And so providing consumers that transparency really does allow them to be in control of their spending because they actually know what they're buying and what they have purchased in the past.
And I'm sorry, I'm just sort of the questions are coming as you're as you're talking, and I because I love what you're saying. There's a lot of questions. In terms of the retailers themselves, I mean, you mentioned that they're benefiting from
Yes.
sort of seeing that sort of, like you said, SKU, identification detail. How does that work exactly? Like how helpful is that? How do the merchants feel about it? How does that even kind of work in terms of like a digital sharing?
Yeah, so it's actually all based on the integration of the retailer into Klarna, whether that's through a direct integration or through a partner like an Adyen or a Stripe or a PSP or an acquirer. And so we're actually getting an API feed of their product. And so it's actually coming from the retailer because ultimately we know the more richer of an experience within our app, the better the consumer is going to interact with not only Klarna, but the brand themselves. And ultimately, unlike a traditional marketplace, Klarna serves to drive traffic back to the retailer's site. So you talk about benefits to retailers, it's that we can drive repeat purchases, we can drive engagement with their brand and their products through Klarna's app, but without taking them outside of the retailer's ecosystem, like an Amazon, for example, which is very much pushing consumers to shop in the Amazon app. When you're shopping in the Klarna app, you're actually shopping on the retailer's site within our browser. And so it's a lot better for the retailer because we're able to provide them data around what their consumer shopping behavior is, but also helping them drive other goals that they might have or targeting audiences that they're looking to maybe that they're underpenetrated in from a sales standpoint. And so that could look like various things, but we can highlight them more in the app. And every market is different in the capabilities we have. But when you start thinking about, why would a consumer use Klarna over a credit card? Well, you can still use your credit card as an embedded payment method within Klarna's app. And so that might allow you to stack up your benefits. So in the US, for example, we have a cashback program, which is essentially like a percentage back that goes into your Klarna account that you can then spend on subsequent future purchases. And then if you think about that layering onto the credit card points, the value proposition is growing there as well.
So no one's saying don't use one or the other, or don't have one or the other. What people are saying is, and certainly what you would be saying is, use both.
Right.
So when you're talking to individuals, or you're talking to merchants, or even if you're just talking generally, looking at it from the industry vantage point that you have,
Yep.
how do you convince people to do that? How do you tell them, hey, it's okay, like choose Klarna for this, choose a credit card for that, they're connected anyway. Like how do you?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's about the consumer. Giving them the options and allowing them to select from what they want. And so like even when you're going into the Klarna kind of module from paying, we give the consumer the ability to pay completely upfront. So what we call pay in full. So maybe they just like the ability to have that rich Klarna experience in the app, but they don't necessarily want to pay it in full, or they don't want to finance a transaction over 6, 12, et cetera months.
Right.
We let them pay in full. And so if you think about like our payment mix globally, and this is where, where we're more mature in markets like Germany or the Nordics, like Sweden, where we started, 80% of the adult population might be using Klarna on a daily basis, but they're not using it in a credit vehicle. They're using it just to pay because they like the experience. And so presenting them with, multiple various payment options at checkout really does allow them to be in control of how they want to spend at that time. Maybe I'm buying $1,000 parka and it makes sense for me to split that over 6 installments or over a year because it is quite a lot to, pay over one paycheck, let's say. But maybe when I'm buying my groceries, I just want to pay with Klarna because I'm, a loyal Klarna customer. And so it just does depend, but allowing the flexibility all in one payment method or, Klarna being the payment method does give them that control.
Now I'm way off track with all their questions.
No,
that I
fine,
know, yeah. But I mean, maybe this will bring us a little bit back more towards sort of the Canada question. So here in Canada, it tends to be more, traditional people either, pay for it with a debit card, with a credit card. It's because of the, sort of the banking system, right? It's a little bit closed.
Yep.
Do you feel that that's had an impact or, has affected Klarna in terms of its recognition here among consumers?
Yeah, I think it's certainly like the conservative nature of the Canadian banking system and payments infrastructure has, maybe been led to the reason why Klarna was maybe a little bit late to launch in the market. But it's also provided a huge opportunity because there hasn't been a lot of innovation. I think to a certain extent because we have 5 large banks, because maybe we're a little bit more regulated, innovation's been stifled a bit. And so a company like Klarna that has innovated for years and years and years in various markets, kind of honed in on what we believe is the value proposition to consumers or merchants, we can then take those learnings and bring them to a market like Canada that is maybe being a little bit underserved or is a little less mature. And we know what's going to really help kind of attract customers, but also bring that value proposition to merchants in the form of, driving incremental spend, driving higher average order value, better conversion, or just traffic to their sites from Gen Z, millennials, or high intent shoppers.
You are not disappointing on your knowledge of the payments business. This is awesome. So critics do say that buy now, pay later, and again, we had this discussion already. You guys are not necessarily buy now, pay later. You're much more than that.
Yeah.
But the concept of buy now, pay later gets people to spend more, put themselves more into debt, and really get themselves in financial difficulty. Talk to us about why Klarna does not necessarily do that. And I believe you have some numbers to prove it.
Yeah. So in general, there is data around that buy now, pay later, or Klarna, or whatever you want to call it, is not necessarily driving an increase in total debt. And when you look at the debt that an average Klarna customer has on file, let's say, it's about $88. If you compare that to credit cards, it's about $6,500. So that's a huge difference. 99% of our consumers are repaying on time and in full. And ultimately, we have less than 0.4% losses over all of the kind of credit lending payments that we're doing. And so it's extremely low, and certainly I think 10 times less low than what you're seeing with credit cards. So it is very much a misconception that we're putting consumers more into debt versus putting them more in control of their spending.
So where does this perception that, yes, again, I realize you can't necessarily speak for everybody, but the perception that is what it is, that what Klarna is doing, where does that come from?
I think it just comes from a lack of understanding of where innovation has gone in the payments industry. I think people hear, another credit vehicle compounding on credit cards is going to be bad without actually understanding the mechanics of how Klarna goes to market and the benefits we're driving to the consumer and the data behind it. There's always going to be consumers that maybe are irresponsible. And that's why the beauty of our underwriting model helps prevent that. Because ultimately, if a customer does not pay Klarna back, we're just going to not allow them to transact. Whereas if you were to have a consumer that knows they're not going to pay their credit card company back, but they have a limit of $10,000, $20,000, and they've already overspent that, it's too late.
Yes.
And that's not possible with Klarna because of our transactional underwriting method.
Interesting. Now, what happens, again, sort of one of the comparisons is, credit cards, they offer sort of that flexibility, but then they nail you on the interest. But then again, this isn't what this is sort of the perception.
Yeah.
So does buy now, pay later.
Yeah. So, ultimately, like I mentioned before, 20% of our payments are, just pay in full. So there is no interest there. And then our pay in 4 installments is also interest free. If a consumer doesn't pay that back, we'll just turn them off. And so it's not driving up revolving debt, which is what credit cards and payday loans do, where you're having interest on top of interest if you continue not to pay. Ultimately, we just won't allow you to transact. And that's where we're really helping prevent consumers from going further into debt, while also potentially giving them the flexibility of having credit if they choose to pay on time and pay in full.
Sideball question, but why wouldn't banks develop a similar type of effort and approach and then compete with you guys?
Well, I think for a long time, banks have not really spoken the consumer's language. They're not necessarily doing things in the consumer's benefit. They're doing things in the benefit of their bottom line, whether that's to drive revenue, to drive more customers, but ultimately taking advantage of those customers by charging high interest. Whereas Klarna wants to potentially charge interest on longer term loans, but in a very much reliable and transparent way that isn't necessarily bearing what APR they're going to pay and a bunch of text. It's very much transparent. If you're choosing a loan that has interest, you will understand what that repayment looks like. Or you have the ability to just choose something that is completely interest-free, which is the typical buy now, pay later that people know Klarna for and the industry for.
And, and I know we talked a little bit about Canada and some of the differences geographically. You and I had talked a little bit off camera about open banking or lack thereof. Now, what is it that you think needs to change in Canada and maybe other jurisdictions too, if any come to mind, that will sort of allow Klarna to really more be a fully, available type of option for consumers and for merchants?
Yeah, I think it's already happening in other markets. Part of it might be legislation around buy now, pay later, but that legislation really does need to meet the needs of the actual product. So today, if you look at how credit bureaus are reported to from other credit vehicles like credit cards. Small micro loans, essentially like what Klarna is doing, are not taking into account the ability for customers to repay those quickly. And so ultimately it's potentially negatively impacting a score versus if you were to take that data and make it more specific to the vertical, which is, what's happening in the UK, for example, and what the US is looking at is going to help a consumer grow their credit. And then it does make sense. And so that's not something that is yet on the table in Canada, but ultimately it will help consumers. And that also helps educate the market as far as like how ultimately buy now, pay later is not putting consumers more into debt.
Clearly, Klarna does have some competition. Here in Canada, you have Sezzle, you have different, options that people can choose, especially online when they're checking out. So tell us how you feel in Canada, and then also, elsewhere, at least from what your colleagues say, Klarna really sort of differentiates itself.
Sure, yeah, and you're right. There's tons of competitors in this space. You mentioned Sezzle, you have Affirm, Afterpay, then you see ShopPay has grown into launching an installment product, same with PayPal. And so how do we differentiate ourselves? I think one of the biggest things is we are one of the largest and kind of pioneers. So we have a lot of knowledge of who our consumers are, what they like, and how to engage them, which ultimately helps us innovate and bring products to the table that help both merchants and the consumer themselves, making them more sticky and driving some of those things like AOV and conversion. But then it's also our payment mix. So by market, we have different payment methods. And I touched on it before as well. Like, you might want to pay now, you might want to pay in full, you might have financing in European markets. Pay later in 30 days is popular. And so having multiple payment methods is certainly a big one. And then it's the really size and scale. Most of our competitors are in 1, 2, maybe 3 markets when I'm talking about the more traditional buy now, pay later partners, competitors. And so that's a big thing. So Klarna is in over 20 markets from a payments perspective. From an app and ecosystem perspective, we're in over 45. And so much larger scale. That also means we have a lot more engaged consumers. Globally, we have over 110 million consumers now. In Canada, it's just over 2.3 million. And so the number of consumers does matter because that's ultimately the audience we're able to target and bring to the table and help drive traffic to consumer sites. So that's a big piece. And then it's our ecosystem. And so our ecosystem, whether that's all of the bells and whistles within our app that are helping drive more engagement with our consumers, or it's our secure technologies that are helping to make transactions more transparent and more smooth to the consumer.
And just a side question, like how much of a challenge do you find it takes to convince a merchant, for instance, or a retailer to really understand that? Like, obviously you're not necessarily out there knocking on doors, but I mean, you've obviously been in a position where it's like, okay, I've got to sort of, convince the doubters.
Yeah, I think part of it is understanding their business needs and their goals. And where they are on their journey of, e-commerce, platforming, tech stack, et cetera. And then understanding what their goals are and kind of building business cases around it. So understanding, how many consumers they see coming into their ecosystem as a website or a store, understanding the types of goals they have from a product perspective or conversion perspective, and then helping them build out the business case based on, their vertical. And so we can very much pull data from our knowledge of how we've helped other retailers drive an increase in AOV or conversion, and then apply that to those business goals or those business metrics of whatever retailer that we might be talking to, and then build out the business case from there to truly show them the value. And then, once we do launch, having regular check-ins where we're providing them insights around data that we have available, we're providing them performance, and ultimately pivoting and optimizing from there.
If there were one thing that you felt could or would be something that could be changed, and again, within the Canadian banking system, within the regulation framework, if there was one thing that would sort of make it more, let's call it accessible for Klarna to be offered, what would it be?
I think a big part of it is just like openness in the banking industry. And maybe that's not open banking as a definition, because there's probably a lot of definitions there.
And by the way, we're prefacing this because you're not necessarily a regulation expert or legislation expert, so I'm sort of putting you on the spot. But from your own perspective.
I mean, Klarna goes to market in different ways, but ultimately our aspiration is to be a global digital bank. And so, in Canada, that might mean partnering with a bank. And so the banks have a better appetite or more of an appetite to partner with companies like Klarna versus seeing us competitive to their business, I think is important because ultimately we are large, we are on a global level, and we have proven that consumers want to use us. And so rather than seeing Klarna as a competitors, it might be more interesting if banks saw us as a partner to help drive some of their goals or access to customers that maybe they can't get to today.
So one of the things that I really did want to get into, and I realize you can't necessarily name names, is, looking at a retailer that perhaps has seen their own experience. And again, I'm thinking big, but it could be small. Just someone maybe who comes to mind that perhaps has really seen an impact. I'm going to go positive here.
Yeah.
You can go negative if you want, in terms of, how Klarna has maybe changed their business model.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think Klarna being new and buy now, pay later being maybe less mature in Canada, a lot of merchants aren't necessarily believers. And so when you end up working with, a big box retailer, for example, and then you're able to show them that you can drive 5-10% share of checkout online, which is a pretty substantial amount for a large retailer, and the amount of transactions that Klarna is transacting, they're then looking at, what are consumers buying? Why are they buying? How much are they spending? And if Klarna is truly, like we are, able to show that we're driving a much higher average order value, then maybe merchants are able to look at, okay, how do I use Klarna to drive sales in segments of their business that maybe aren't doing as well? Maybe that's electronics, maybe that's outdoor furniture. So, SKU level strategies that help them to achieve their goals as a business, where maybe they want to get away from smaller purchases or being known for grocery or being known for, pharmacy-based goods, and they want to sell other goods that they've added as far as their SKUs that they're selling. And so using Klarna to do that, whether it's in-store signage or whether it's featuring Klarna in different areas of their website to create that consumer awareness. Because ultimately, when consumers see Klarna through their shopping journey, whether it's online or in store, they're more aware of that they could potentially spend a bit more. They'll be aware of their spending power and having the ability to buy more and spend over a longer period of time. So perhaps they are making a smarter purchase decision, ultimately converting on something where they maybe wouldn't have purchased it before. And that's not to say they're spending irresponsibly. They're actually spending more smarter because they know that they can potentially have longer time to pay that off without bearing interest that they might have on a credit card, but they're doing the same thing.
It's a different option. Obviously, it's a different way of payment. Yeah. And it's interesting because, I'm known for being under rock. So, this stuff comes to me late, but, it is interesting that, I think a lot of people and you can tell me the momentum is still picking up in terms of adaptation, in terms on both the merchant side and consumer side. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And the other thing is that beyond I mentioned getting Klarna to help them drive sales in certain products, it could be other KPIs that they have. So maybe it's they want customers to download their app. And so forcing a customer to download their app before they use Klarna or whatever it might be is another thing that they can leverage Klarna for. And so because Klarna's brand is relatively well known, leveraging our brand to help drive customer traffic to them in our shopping ecosystem is another big aspect of how we work with retailers. So beyond what just our payment strategy is, how do we use our ecosystem where, in Canada, we have maybe 1.3 million active monthly users in our app. How do we engage them in our app to drive traffic back to that retailer?
Now, you mentioned earlier the sort of the rough use case in Canada, the percentage of the population. We're talking like 28 million people.
Yeah.
Obviously, Canada is about a tenth the size of the U.S.
Yeah.
Looking at Canada, looking at the U.S., and looking at other places, where do you see some of the bigger opportunities? And I'm talking just Klarna in general.
Yeah, I think definitely it's building out, like in Canada, like our app infrastructure and the features we have are not quite where they are in other markets because of the time in market. And so really the opportunity is just driving more consumers to use Klarna by building out the value proposition around Klarna. And so that's a lot of what our functionality in our app is. So being able to search and compare items at a SKU level basis, so you can see where you can buy it at the best price or the fastest delivery time. Being able to track your purchases in the app, being able to wish list items, and creating this ecosystem where shoppers come there to shop. And I think that's really important because consumers are ultimately in the Klarna app to shop. They have high intent, which means they have higher conversion. And so working with retailers to feature them in our app where consumers are really very much motivated to shop versus floating them an advertisement on Twitter or Meta isn't going to necessarily convert on transactions because they're there to see pictures of their family. They're there to read news versus they're in the Klarna app to shop. And so using that as a means to drive consumer conversion, drive consumer sales is something that's pretty invaluable to retailers.
Yeah, no, and I can see that for sure. Now, education, we've touched on that in a number of different ways. Again, merchant and consumer. And again, if Klarna has I'm sure they have a whole massive education, page or pages dedicated to all this. But tell me where you would want people to start to focus on from an education perspective, just to understand what this option actually is, what Klarna actually is.
Yeah, I think even as simple as just downloading the Klarna app, going on the website, really understanding it and trying it out, seeing the experience. You can't get a better experience than really trying to actually do it. Listening something like this, even as an example, but I think a lot of people just assume it's one thing without actually having tried it. And, Klarna really was the way we kind of grew up in Stockholm and Europe was the PayPal of Europe. And so, lots and lots of people know the PayPal brand. Lots of people are using PayPal. And so globally, as kind of things become more universal across all markets, Klarna has become, very much popular, and certainly that's becoming true in Canada and North America. And so part of that is just trying it out, but also it is a generational thing. So Klarna is known for driving more Gen Z millennials to be digitally first consumers. And so part of it is just trying it out.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you had to tell your mom, your dad, your niece, your nephew, anybody, why they should trust using Klarna and why they should do it and the benefits of it in 30 seconds or less, what would you say?
I would say that its ability to really engage at a different level with the payment method that you're using. If you think about a traditional bank, you probably not have a relationship with them. Whereas the average Klarna customer is actually a fan of Klarna. And so they actually enjoy using it because of the rich experience post-purchase and the ability to do different things in the app that really are driving value to the consumer and speaking their own language.
So I'm going to send that one to Sebastian, and I'm going to try it a little differently. And what I'm going to say is that I think, what people really, truly don't seem to understand is that it's not just another way to pay. It's not just using Visa or MasterCard or using debit or credit. It's literally it's postponing payments. It's literally an ecosystem.
Correct.
To buy stuff.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's also driving other value, some of the things I mentioned, whether it's, cashback, which is maybe similar to rewards you get with your credit card, but it's a much more engaging, richer experience than what maybe a traditional credit card would be.
I'm going to try Klarna when I go and buy my holiday presents. So there you go. I've never tried it before, so why not? This has convinced me. So great. Well, thank you again. Thanks for joining us, Steven. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
And now for the legalese. The information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute financial investment or legal advice. Always do your own research and consult with a licensed financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and all investments carry risk. The views expressed are those of the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of any affiliated organizations.